Hi, thanks for tuning in to another episode of My Next Property. My name is Steve Ash. I'm the founder of Property Strats. I've got an 80 mil portfolio and I'm helping everyday Australians achieve the same outcome. So I'm very excited. I'm up in the Gold Coast today. I have Theo joining me. Thanks for sort of coming up from Sydney to sunny Queensland. How are you finding it so far?
It was a very interesting trip. It was so wet.
Yeah, I was being ironical. It's definitely not sunny Queensland today. It's absolutely pissing down out there. In fact, we had to do a bit of prep work before we came in the studio.
We did.
Yeah.
I got absolutely drenched coming into the studio. And so I had to dry my shirt makeshift with the air conditioning and some paper towels in the bathroom. But here we go.
We've done a good job. It's looking pretty dry. In fact, we were looking at the Red Cross shop just to sort of see if there's any black T-shirts. That's how bad it was out there. But next time you come up, I'm sure we'll have better weather for you. But no, thanks for coming up. Now, this is what we wanted to do for this particular sort of episode. We did an episode a few weeks ago where we were talking about the impact of the Brisbane Olympics on sort of suburbs or hotspotting suburbs, if you will, in Brisbane. But I thought it'd be great to have you on board. You know, you're a student of the market. You kind of look at it in very different ways. And so in this particular episode, what we wanted to do is maybe deconstruct and look at what happened, because history gives us a bit of a lens into the future, what would happen, say, in Brisbane. So we're thinking for this episode just to go and have a look at what happened in Sydney for the 2000 Olympics and what you saw on the ground. And I know you've done a lot of analysis on this. So I thought if we could unpack that a little bit and then see sort of what are some of the lessons learned, what we saw in history, and then sort of take those themes and what we might be seeing currently in the Brisbane market, how we can think about as a property investors and what sort of areas to keep an eye on. So if that's okay with you, it'd be good to pick your brain on this.
Absolutely. Sydney taught us a lot of things. You know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. But certain themes can reemerge. And I think learning about what happened prior to Sydney 2000 and post Sydney 2000 can give us some level of indication for what could happen prior to Brisbane 2032 and post Brisbane 2032.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it would be good to unpack some of those themes. And we talked a lot about this before we came on air earlier. So what did you see really in the build-up? I think you were talking a lot was priced in before the 2000, but if you just give me a rough idea on some of the infrastructure projects and what you saw.
At a very high level, between 1993 and 2000, Sydney roughly increased by approximately 60%.
Wow.
Which was nearly double the national average. After 2000, between 2000 and 2002, the increase had been priced in to some extent, and so we saw a slower rate of growth. For the Sydney Olympics, there were a lot of upgrades that drove the increases in prices, including major projects, policy objectives, differing land uses, and also the promotion of Sydney as a city as well.
Yep.
And we can dive into these things to learn about what will happen potentially in Brisbane.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Like, obviously, what exactly happened in Sydney isn't going to happen in Brisbane, but I think it's a good sort of predeterminant. So you're talking about some infrastructure sort of projects, obviously, that happened there. And it's not really, obviously, we know kind of with Homebush, for example, you know, the developments and the infrastructure that happened out in West Sydney, but that kind of spilled over into some other sort of areas like, you know, you were talking about before. So maybe you could just unpack that a little bit.
It did. So beyond Sydney Olympic Park and Stadium Australia, two things I'd like to focus on are the airport upgrades and the rail link upgrades.
Yeah.
And also the major road upgrades, in particular, the M4 extension and the Eastern Distributor.
Yeah.
And these had impacts in accessibility of certain areas in the city. And so that allowed for growth in those areas.
Okay.
Specifically, access to Western Sydney was improved. Access to Homebush, of course, for the Olympics was improved, but also with that as well, the surrounding areas experienced uplift too. Yeah.
Any examples that you saw in that time? Obviously, Homebush would have like any areas like you're talking about the Eastern Distributor. Would that kind of like spill into say the eastern suburbs in Sydney? You saw the big growth, or what were we seeing?
So the eastern suburbs was impacted, but the big growth areas were in and around the western suburbs precinct. So of course. Homebush itself increased, and then surrounding areas, even more obscure areas like Ryde, for example, also experienced increase.
Okay, so some of these infrastructure projects in West Sydney, we saw some of these suburbs do quite well. So just give me a couple of ones that you saw back then, that you saw some outperformance, like the asset type and suburb.
Well, back then I was 6 years old when the games occurred, but I did have a look at them after the fact.
Yes.
Two areas that I have noted that were impacted by the M4 extension were Auburn and Parramatta, for example. These areas had an increased level and increased ease of road access, in particular a reduced transit time to the city of Sydney. And so leading up to 2000 became more desirable.
Okay. I imagine how Parramatta would have looked back then. It's massive, second hub of Sydney now. So, but yeah, obviously a few things, and we'd have seen quite a bit of appreciation in those areas, which you probably wouldn't have expected, maybe, when you think about Sydney Olympics. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, thinking about the Olympics, you usually get focused and drawn in on the 2-week event. You think about typically the landmark things in the city.
Yeah.
And you also think about the Olympic venues themselves. Whereas I think second to that, but importantly, and for a long period of time, you have the flow-on effect of the infrastructure upgrades, which is why, the New South Wales government and why, the governments in general like hosting the Olympics, because of the, I suppose, longer-term uplift. But to throw it back at you, though, Brisbane 2032, they've announced infrastructure upgrades. Do you think transport is going to have an effect on prices in areas in Brisbane?
No, it's a good question, and it's interesting that obviously think about what's happened in Sydney. Olympics were obviously announced by Anastasia Palaszczuk back in 2021, so well into that cycle. So you were kind of unpacking that a little bit with Sydney, whereby a lot of the growth happened pre-games. And so we're obviously since 2021, prices in Brisbane, they were kind of booming already before that, but they've skyrocketed since then. So some sort of infrastructure projects that we've had announced, obviously it took a while, but we've got the Olympic Stadium. We finally made a call on that. It's coming into Victoria Park. So we've got the Cross River Rail, which is another 4 new stations. So that's down Wollongabba. There's a lot going on, a lot of infrastructure going on in that particular area. And then we're going to see upgrades to infrastructure from the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. The rail links upgraded, roads upgraded. So there have been works going on the Bruce Highway, which is always congested when you go up to the Sunshine Coast. And so I think there's a lot going on. I mean, the numbers we talked about in the last pod, I think it's 58,000 workers needed to construct that stadium and other sort of items around Brisbane. But generally the whole feel around Brisbane has been changing for quite a while. There's been a lot of works, and this wasn't with the Olympics in mind, but we saw the South Bank is a completely different area now. It's a beautiful spot. We've had the Star Casino sort of, I'm going to say released, but it was open for business about a year ago, and so there's a lot more going on. Really good vibe in the centre of Brisbane. They're doing stuff on Eagle Street Pier, so all of this is kind of factoring in. So some really big infrastructure sort of upgrades, a lot of money being spent, and so far that's being kind of seen in the property prices. Really, one of the things we're talking about, and I think it's quite important to talk about with Sydney. Sydney obviously had that boom with the Olympics, and now all of a sudden Sydney is the Olympic city. There's always that story, all of things that kind of resonate from back then, and Brisbane's going through that too. But I think Brisbane, from a long-term investing point of view, has always held a lot of value, and having the Olympics is obviously going to put Brisbane on the map, and there's a number of suburbs which will stand to do quite well through that. So every year it seems there's more cars on the road, and there's a lot more people up here. Our lifestyle's great. We're kind of in close proximity to 2 amazing places in the world, and in the sunny coast and the Gold Coast. But yeah, things are looking good up here at the moment.
I completely agree with your points about Brisbane and the increase expected. What areas do you think are going to benefit most from this Olympic hype?
Well, no, there's, I mean, if we just kind of come back, like we're talking about Sydney and some of the images from back then in Brisbane, is quite exciting as a Brisbaneite 2032 to think, a shout out to my golf club, they're going to be hosting Olympic golf, but to think that, say, someone like Rory McIlroy or Scotty Scheffler is going to be on the course. In Petrie, you've got the basketball sort of centre, so you're going to have the dream team there. I mean, that's pretty crazy. You think they're coming over to Brisbane, so obviously that's really going to put Brisbane on the world map. But if we kind of break down a few suburbs that stand to benefit, and we talked about some infrastructure sort of projects like the Cross River Rail, the Olympic Stadium. So obviously, if we break this down into two sort of asset types, like houses and units. So if I think about kind of like the stadium and just there and thereabouts, so those kind of suburbs that are quite close in proximity to Victoria Park, you've got the likes of Kelvin Grove, apartments there, maybe boutique type blocks or whatever, like in close proximity. I think they're going to do very well. Maybe if we look a little bit further out, Newmarket and Alderley, again, very undervalued from a unit point of view. Houses in those areas are very, very expensive now. So you've got a pretty good disparity between unit prices and house prices. So I think they'll tend to do quite well. If we look where the Olympic Village is going to be, it's going to be Bowen Hills. Bowen Hills slightly north of the CBD. There's quite a few high rises there. Obviously, house prices, there's much more units in that suburb than sort of houses, but I do think there'll be an uptick there. From an investor point of view, I'd still be looking again at boutique blocks. Not to sound like a broken record, I always talk about this. So I think that's a decent area that's going to do quite well. If we look at some of these infrastructure type projects, I was talking about the Bruce Highway upgrade and those links up to the sunny coast. And I was also talking about the Dream Team. Not that I know much about basketball. The story I was telling before we came on air about not knowing a famous basketball player I played golf with. But I think Petrie is a suburb. It's about 22 Ks, the CBD north. I think that's an area that'll do quite well. You've already got, so you've got the Olympic Stadium, so the basketball indoor centre coming in there, some works going up, so it's going to be easy to get up to the Sunshine Coast, North Lakes, etc. There's a fast train line from Petrie into the CBD, so we can bypass a lot of works. But say a house in that type of area on decent land on 600 to 800 square metres still can pick them up sort of 850 to 950. You factor that in with the first home buyers grant, so there's a good melting pot and a good case to sort of look at those type of plays as well. And then if we look south as well, and we look at kind of all the works going on in the Gold Coast where we are at the moment, and we think about rail line upgrades, and we think about kind of upgrades to the freeway, sort of Logan Lee and Logan in general, Logan being about a third of the way from Brisbane down to the Gold Coast, I think Logan's been on a blast for a long time. But I'm just thinking like Logan Lee being on that train line and that fast train line into the city, better links getting from Gold Coast into there. Prices are still doing really well. Who would have thought like Logan, like in places like Shayla Park, for example, Slacks Creek, almost $1 million suburbs now. We're certainly seeing $1 million sales. And so that's kind of what I keep my eye on. Places like Logan Lee, Crestmead, Marsden, that sort of middle ring of suburbs, if you will, I think should stand to do quite well. And obviously they've had big growths. But I think with the Olympics and the sentiment and kind of infrastructure plays, already a very tight vacancy rate as there is, not too much stock on market. If there's a good property, it has multiple offers still. So I think Brisbane, as a long-term thesis, I think the Olympics helps with that, but I think it will continue to see strong and stable growth. So that would be my comments, Theo.
Touching on the shortage of stock and also touching on the low vacancy rates currently, we have a little bit of a difference between what's currently happening versus what happened prior to the Sydney 2000 games. So the climate in the early to mid-90s, there was more of a housing supply on the market and the vacancy rates were higher. Compare and contrast that to Brisbane now, and the stock on market is lower and the vacancy rates are lower as well. Yeah. And so this is a very different contextual dynamic going into the games. How do you think that is going to affect property prices?
I mean, it's a good question. It's a big, and I wish I had my crystal ball. I think from a long-term point of view, it's a strange one. Generally, and what we've been talking to clients a lot is that when markets have moved so much like they have in Brisbane, it's time to be aware. But I think we're in a different sort of situation. We've still got like 7 years as of now till the Olympics come, and I think we'll just see stable growth. But certainly, I think there'll be a bit of a two-tiered sort of market, if you will. Like obviously, any affordable pocket's going to do quite well, but we're seeing some suburbs all of a sudden hitting Sydney type levels now, and so obviously from an investing point of view, we're not going to be looking at those. But I see maybe a bit of volatility in the top of the market. But I do think in those kind of affordable levels, and to be quite honest, like hardly any houses now. We're thinking Moreton Bay, Logan, Redlands Bay, Ipswich. Maybe Ipswich probably has a bigger proportion of them. Like we're not seeing much below sort of 800 to 900 now. It's crazy, like in house prices. And
Wow.
so it's going to be those affordable markets that'll do well out of the Olympics. I think the unit plays, the townhouse plays, and then really anything I'd say up to that sort of 1.1, 1.2 mark, especially with incentives that are out there at the moment. So as I said a second ago, Theo, I think it'll be slow and steady. And I think we'll probably see double-digit growth in some asset types for the next few years. As crazy as it sounds, it's simple supply-demand. There's just not enough houses in there for people in Brisbane. So while it generally be buyer beware, like if we think of Perth, for example, it might be a case, to be very careful there. Brisbane, if people do want exposure to the Queensland market, there's still opportunity here.
Absolutely. In addition to looking at the data set online, one of the references I like to take when looking at the suburb in general is my gut feel and what I observe when walking around. Unfortunately, prior to the Sydney Games, I was 2, 3, 4 years old, so I don't have quite a good recollection of it.
Yeah.
But the gut feel and being immersed in the suburb and knowing it quite well, in my opinion, is a strong indicator alongside what all the data online, what the valuations, etc. say. You're living up here, you're in and around these areas frequently. What difference have you observed just walking around anecdotally, moving through them, that supports this indication? For example, have you noticed these areas materially change, and if so, how?
No, it's a good question. I think what you're saying about the supply demand imbalance, and applications that pick this up, obviously that lags. Again, stock's very tightly held. I think that's the clearest thing to see with the property market in Brisbane. Any good investment grade property that's not in a bushfire zone, flood zone, not opposite a school, pylons, whatever it might be, is selling well. It's still getting multiple offers, and so the opens I go to, you still see multiple people, especially in the affordable end. So that's doing well. But if we kind of just walk around the city, like even those kind of assets that you think you'd stay away from, like just take West End, for example. So it's in a flood area. I'm not saying to go out and buy in West End, but it's a very nice place to live. You're close to South Bank, and sort of West End's been on a tear. It's been doing really well. But I can see why, because you can see you've had I think it's a Centenary Bridge from Kangaroo Point across the city. So it's much easier to get from there in now. Just to you've got the South Bank to get over, the casino. Like the other day, sort of my family and I, we were sort of walking around, and there was a drone show going on over the river.
High tech.
So it is high tech. It's amazing what it is. The drones becoming dragons. So this sort of stuff wasn't really happening 4 or 5 years ago. And there's a lot more. There's companies with head offices up in Brisbane. You're seeing a lot more sort of infrastructure, changes happening to the city. Obviously, the station's going in as the Cross River Rail. It just feels completely different. Like Eagle Street Pier, as I alluded to before, that's being replaced. You got Felons just under the Story Bridge is always packed. But it just feels like we're coming in, and Brisbane was maybe the sleepy town 20 years ago. Now it's a real vibrant city, and I think that's going to translate. It's already translating into explosive growth in property prices, but I think slow and steady growth going forward.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
Desirability increases property prices.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So I think if we kind of unpack this, I think it was great, going back in time, even though you were 6, and seeing kind of like the impact of the Olympics in Sydney, and then taking some of those lessons like big infrastructure, seeing how West Sydney was impacted, and other suburbs, and then sort of pulling that up to now with Brisbane. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting place for the next 7 years until the Olympics. I'm very excited to go and watch a few events and just unpacking some suburbs. Again, with the first home buyers grant, there's still so many areas where you can look at if you do want exposure to Brisbane. And so while we could say we're quite close to maybe top of the market, I think there's a special situation here where there's going to be more to come.
What I'm excited to see in Brisbane is how the regional approach plays out. And so in the Sydney Olympics, we saw a lot of the Olympic venues clustered around the western suburbs, Olympic Park, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas in Brisbane, my understanding is the venues themselves have been spread out a little bit more regionally. And so more areas will be impacted. And I'm just excited from, I suppose, a curious research perspective, to watch this unfold and then compare and contrast it to Sydney.
No, it's going to be interesting. And like, as we're talking about some regional places, Gold Coast is busier than ever. Just people everywhere, lots of changes happen to the foreshore, etc., and sunny coast as well. And it's going to be interesting how that translates to some other regional areas. So I think that's a good point. But no, it's good to do another sort of episode on Brisbane suburbs and the impact the Olympics might have. So be interesting to get people's sort of views, and put your comments in below what you're seeing on the ground. Always interested to hear them. But if this helps, and from an investment thesis, and if you want to get into the Brisbane market, there's a few ideas that we talked about to summarise, sort of like Kelvin Grove, Alderley, Newmarket, Petrie, Logan Lee. Still a few suburbs of opportunity there. But I think we're gonna wrap up here. I'm gonna sort of get you an umbrella so we don't get wet on the way back. But thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Okay, thanks.